We recently put out a video about how you can use this new feature in Airtable to track time and replace tools like Harvest and Toggl. Well, that video got so many questions, a lot of folks asking questions about how to do things that we didn't have time to cover in the first video. Well, I want to make sure that everyone gets their questions answered, so we're putting together this unplanned part 2 and gonna slide it on in here so that you can see how to fully complete these solutions and appeal to a lot of different user types and situations. So if learning more about tracking time in Airtable is of interest to you, stick around and let's get into it. Welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name is Gareth and this is Gap Consulting. It's our mission to help you unlock the full potential of your no-code tools so that you can truly escape the mess that is spreadsheets. And Airtable, obviously, is one of our favorite no-code tools and the one that we're going to be talking about here. Now, before we get into the heart of this video, I first want to invite you to join me for some templates. If you're newer to Airtable in general, we've put together 5 amazing templates with interfaces built on top of them so that you can get in Airtable and really start deploying it out to your team and getting away from those nasty spreadsheets. Grab those templates absolutely free at gapconsulting.io/templates. But without further ado, let's hop on into the heart of the video. And here in my screen, I've brought back the database that we were using in the last video. I'd originally deleted this. I had to retrieve it from my trash can inside of Airtable, but here it is back and loaded, and we have our interfaces to boot. Now, you may remember that we put together an interface from part 1 where we can select a project and start a trigger to start calculating some time. So if we were to look at this over here, we see that on project 2, where we left off, we created this record by pushing this button. It clicks in and starts tracking our time, and that time won't end until we wrap up. And so that's what we're really going to be addressing here. But the first question I got had to do with pausing a timer. How can you do this? Well, here's the rub, right? When we are in Airtable, we are adding this one field right here, and we're going to be inserting an end time here. So there's really not a way to pause a timer per se, because if we go back into the database itself, and this is where we do all of our calculations and fancy stuff, back here we have this duration field. It's a formula and it's calculating based on start and end time. Now we put this formula together in part 1. So if this looks a little foreign or confusing, just go back and watch the first video and get caught up for us here. So we are calculating based on that start and end time. There's no way to compute that output, the duration between these two times, and insert a pause. Like we could, I guess, create additional fields that, we can say, okay, subtract 5 minutes from that ultimate duration calculation. But it seems like a lot of unnecessary work. I think the easier answer here is if you need to pause your timer, just stop the timer. Stop this particular time log, fill out an end time. And then when you're ready to start again, just create a new time log. So if that means that you have 2 time logs for the same day and there's a 5-minute gap between when one ends and the next one starts, cool, you had a 5-minute break. It's pretty obvious, I think, what the data is telling us. So I don't really think it's worth putting in the extra effort to create some sort of pause function when you can just close out a time record and create a new one. Next, let's talk about how we can build an automation to end these tasks. That was the big question that we got in numerous different ways. Some of you are asking how to add an inline button. So here we have our time logs, right? And some folks wanted a button in this record that is just here inside of this line that says end this task. But alternatively, you might also want to put a big button up here at the top that is kind of like a meta control over the entire project to end all of the outstanding times. So let's take a look at both of these. Originally, we have this start trigger, and it's more of a meta type of trigger where we know what project we're clicked into. In this case, let's click project 2. And you see it right here. If we start the trigger, it's going to create a new time log for project 2. And it also knows who the user is because we've set up user control rules as the default values. As a quick reminder, let's take a look at that. So we're going to go into our automations, but first navigate to our data. I like to open this in a separate window so I can flip between them, and then I'll open up that automations panel right here. And so our first automation is doing this. It's creating, based on that button push, creating a new time tracking record in that time tracking table connected to the project with the runtime. Now you'll notice that we don't actually assign the user. So this was also assuming that we just had one person kind of in that space. And we did set up a default for the user field. But if we flip back into our data, you're going to see that when we perform it with an automation, it doesn't tell us who ran the automation. It says automations. So what we need to do is actually bring in the current user, the person who pushed the button, and make sure that we get that part in there first. That way we can do more with this. So let's first choose a field, the user field, and we want to dynamically fill this out when we create the time tracking log. And we're going to do so with who pushed the button. So right here in our trigger, when the button is clicked, if we scroll down, we can see the user who took that action, and we can bring that user in. Let's just bring in their ID here. And this now, when we push that button, it's going to create the time tracking log with the user who was actually in the interface pushing the button. So we'll update that. And now back over here on our data page, we're not going to see automations filled out, but we're actually going to see the user who pushed the button. Okay, now that we have that correct, now we have to think about the end time. So back here in our interfaces, let's first talk about building a button that's going to close out all of the open time tracking logs. In this case, we have an open time tracking log without an end time. And so if we wanted to close out all of the logs here and end all of the triggers, we can do that with the push of a button for all of the time tracking logs in Project 2. Let's take a look at how we build this automation. So first things first, we're going to flip over into our automations panel, and we're going to create an automation. And I'll call this end time trackers. And this is going to be when a button is pushed in our interface. So let's find when a button is clicked right here as our triggering action. So we make that selection. Now we don't have a source button yet, so we have to flip back into our interface and create that button. We're going to go to first edit the pages. And over here, where we put in that first button, we'll select that big section, which is basically the project record. And over here, we will find buttons. We have a button for start trigger. We can add another button, and of course, then go to the properties of the button. So right here, by default, it is go to a website. We want to change that. It does not need to go to a URL. We want to change the action step to be trigger an automation. So let's find run automation right here. And there we go. Now we can name this button, and we'll say end time logs, and we choose the automation. Now the one that we just created, end time trackers, is not mapped yet, so we'll map to it right there. Of course, we still have to turn that automation on. So let's flip back now to our automation and finish that. You can see that we've put this together here. And so what is this going to do? Remember, this button lives at the project level. So when we choose a record, we're going to see projects. Let's go with Project 2, assuming, of course, that we have that open time log. It's not yet rounded out. It's not yet toggled off or completed. And what we want to do is search for it. So we know we're in Project 2, and now we're going to perform a search action. We're going to find records related to Project 2 that meet specific conditions. So what table are we looking for these records? They're in our time tracking table. So we're going to look for time tracking logs. We're going to find records based on a condition, and we're going to set up those conditions. Now, condition 1 is that they are relevant to the project where we clicked the button. So we're going to say, well, the project has to match whatever project was the one that triggered the automation. So when the button is clicked, we have the Airtable record ID for the project. So basically we're saying we're looking for all time logs that have a project that is the project from where we pushed the button. But next, we're also going to say the end time is empty. Because if the end time is not empty, that means that that particular record has already been closed out. We don't want to find that one. We only want to find all of the records where they are empty. Now, in a perfect world, we would only ever have one record that has not been closed out, right? That is not marked with the time. So let's perform a search here, but notice that we will find up to 1,000 records if they are all open. Here comes the search. That's my test action. We know that we created this record, this time log, and there was no closeout, right? There's no duration because, of course, the record, the time log, was never closed out, never ended. So what do we do now? Now that we found that open time log, we want to close it out. So we can add this repeating group, meaning for every record that we found in this step, we are going to put in a timestamp. And so we will say, update a record. Note again that this is repeating for all records found here. So if you have multiple time logs open, then you're going to close them all out. Now it just dawned on me that if we have multiple users in here, we probably only want to close out our own time logs. So let's make sure that we're doing that as well in our search function. I'm going to go back to the find here, add one more condition that says the user is, we'll have to scroll over here and we're going to say dynamic because we need to set up the dynamic rules that say the person who pushed the button, right? The user who took the action here, the ID of that user, that's what we want to find. Now we can perform that action step again. It's going to find the same record. But this way, if we're using this time tracker with multiple people in our team, we will only close out our own time logs when we push the button. Okay, so that's the conditions we need. Now let's go into the repeating action. What are we doing? We're going to close out those time logs. How do we do it? Well, we're going to use whatever current item we are cycling on in this find records function. Well, we haven't completed that configuration yet. So let's go back into that repeat step and we have to select an input list. It's all of the records that we found in that particular search, right? We're going to use this as a list and we're going to iterate through it. Now we can update the record. When we click here, we'll simply say, use the current item, whichever one we just found back here, or multiple items if we found multiple, plug in their record ID. What are we doing? We are updating the end time with what? The dynamic time, just like we did in the first video, where we came into that and we said, at a specific time, the runtime of the automation, plug it in there for the end time. So that's it. This now is a complete automation where when the button is clicked for the project, we find all of the open time tracking records for the user who pushed the button on the specific project, and then we will update the time with the actual end time of the automation. Let's turn it on and let's give it a test. Back here, we'll publish our interface changes. One slight thing to note is that our buttons are kind of nasty here. After we add multiple buttons, we don't see them all on the page, and so we get this dot. Unfortunately, we don't have much control over that, but I can still push it, end time logs, and just like that, we're gonna watch this get updated in real time with the current date timestamp. There it goes. It just calculated. Now, of course, it's been over a week since we did the opening of this time log, so our duration is pretty long, but you can see that everything is working appropriately. Now, the other part of this question is people wanted to be able to close out specific time logs inline. So let's imagine what that might look like. In order to get this access, we need to go back to editing the pages here. And if we click into this section right here, this is where we're listing out all of that information. These are the fields that we've made visible. Start time, end time, duration. We can choose to bring more or fewer fields in. Well, if we want to bring a button in line, we can actually create a button inside of our database. So let's flip back into the data really quickly. I'll go back here to my automations and go into my data, and we'll add a button field here. I'll call it button to end time. And there is a button field type available in Airtable. And right here, we can choose some sort of action for this button. We can open a URL, we can open a page designer, but more importantly for our needs here, we could run a script. So this is a little bit more advanced, but what we would do is build the automation that says when this button is pushed, it triggers a script in Airtable that goes in and then performs the automation that we would have built. And so because of the fact that when we run that script, we can pass through what record, what time log are we activating right now, and therefore close out the time for it. Again, because it's in the coding realm of things, it's not something we would normally feature here on this channel, but if there's huge demand for this, do let me know. Personally, I think it's just fine to have it at the high level here and close out all of your records with the one push of a button, any of your outstanding time entries that have not yet been resolved. Now, in the interest of time, I'm going to address some of the smaller questions quickly here. One person asked about how to use multiple users in the system. And we already addressed here in the automations how we would add the actual user who pushed the button when we went back and fixed this automation that we built last time. So make sure to add in the user who took the action. And also when you're closing out the time logs, make sure that you've added that search to know who pushed the button so that you're closing out only their time logs. That's one part. Now, the other part is making sure that people actually see their information. So in the interfaces, on the pages, we can actually hide records that are not assigned or belonging to us. So if we were going back into the database schema again, and we looked at the data itself, on the project level, we don't have a user brought in here, but we do have users in the time tracking field. So let's say we had these 3 different projects and we had different users assigned. I would use the user field type here, and I could assign different people to these projects. Right now, I've set a default option to be for me, but let's say in this particular case, it was me. In another case, it was Sarah. And if we brought in users assigned and allowed multiple users, we could actually bring multiple different users into the same project and make them responsible for it. Now, in our interfaces, we can set up a filtering rule that says only people who are assigned to the project can see that project. And so right here, we would go into the filter on the project. So I've selected projects from the dropdown. I've gone into the filter. And I'm going to say the users assigned has to be the currently logged in user. So immediately when I do that, because I am not on project 2, you see it's removed from my view here. Anybody else who logs into their Airtable interface is only going to see projects that they are assigned to. Similarly, down here in the time tracking logs, we can set up the same filter. So back to editing pages. In the time tracking logs, we'll apply a filter here that says that the time logs that I see are only my time logs. So again, current user. That way, I'm not looking at Sarah's time logs. She's not looking at mine. I'm not looking at Sarah's projects. You get the idea. We're only seeing our data. Now, at a higher level, we can build management interfaces as well that allow us to see all of the projects, all of the time logs, and of course, we would only share those interfaces with management. That way, people who are doing the work are only seeing their stuff, and when we are leading the team, we're able to get that holistic view. Somebody asked a question about subtasks. This is a fairly simple one to answer as well. Here we have time tracking logs, but if you wanted to do subtasks, tasks, etc., you can get as granular as you want. Each layer is its own table. So you can add a new table for tasks. Let's go ahead and set that up really quickly. And then this would link to another table, subtasks. And we can build a link to another record here. We can set up a new table for subtasks. I'll make it a capital S. And so we can set up multiple subtasks. Let's say 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, all relating back to task A. And just like this, we can then create multiple tasks and subtasks within those tasks. And so this is the hierarchy of Airtable. The more you build in databases, the more this will just seem natural, but you can then roll this back up to the projects. And if you want to track time at the subtask level, then instead of linking your time tracking log to the project, you link it to the subtask. Now, addressing one final question here, somebody asked the very smart question of how do we handle time track logs that were not ended? And of course, this comes into play on this very time track log. Look, I started this on February 1st and it didn't end until February 9th. This client is not going to be happy when they receive a bill for 11,000 hours. It's obviously not correct. So we should build some sort of an automation that closes out time trackers on a schedule as well. So just like we did here, let's duplicate this automation, but this copied version, we're going to change this trigger. We're not going to do it when a button is clicked. We'll do it at a scheduled time. So we'll say, hey, listen, we're going to change this trigger to at a scheduled time, and we're going to look at, let's say, a particular day at the end of every day at 6 p.m. So I can just pull that right from a dropdown. Every day at 6 p.m., we're going to perform this automation, test the trigger. It's going to tell us we will next perform this automation at 6 p.m. Okay, now Find the records is a little broken because we don't have projects. In our original automation, we pushed the button for a project. So this condition can go away. Same with users. Nobody's pushing a button, so we don't know what user is doing it. All we care about for this automation is if it's 6 o'clock and we have open time logs, then we need to find them and we need to update them. And so just that simply, we fixed that automation, we launch it. Now every day at 6 o'clock, if there's an open time log, it's going to be closed out. Now I know we went really quickly here. Obviously there were many different questions to cover, and I hope that we shed some light on all of them. But if you have additional questions that we did not fully address here, feel free to drop additional comments below this video or swing by our website. We have incredible consultants standing by that you can book an hour with and get working with immediately to resolve these issues for you and your Airtable setup. I hope you got a ton of value from this video. If you did, give us a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, but most importantly, keep on building.